9, right? And, oh, I'm sorry. We've moved into 10. I'm sorry. Yes. Yeah, you'll have to forgive me again. I guess today is the day of grace, right? We did talk about chapter 9 because all these ideas link together. What Paul is doing is he's making these arguments to try to get us to understand something. And if you guys remember, what's the word he talks about more than any in this book? Righteousness. Righteousness over and over again. So if you think about it, like in our modern world, okay, if we ever needed to understand a term and what it meant, what would that term probably be? What it is to be righteous, right? Because I don't know how many of you watch the news. I do every now and then just to see what's going on TV or see what's going on around the world. And then my phone does it too. But for some reason, my phone always gives me the Australian news, which is interesting as well because then you get to hear the perspective of Australians who are in free fall. Their country is in free fall as they look at us and they say, look at how the Americans are in free fall, right? So, and it is really interesting to think about how much deception and spinning there is through the news and the media, and everybody wants you to believe something so that they can control the narrative and tell you what you should be thinking. I'm not that kind of person. I'm never going to tell you what you should think because you have the evidence laid before you. God doesn't tell us what to think, does he? Never once does he say, think this way, right? Because he gives us the evidence and he gives us the dignity of making the decision on our own terms, okay? And in today's modern world, we think that the answer to everything is just listen to the experts and they know everything, right? And how has that worked out for us so far? It's not too good, right? It's the same if you go through Leviticus and the incident that led up to the golden calf. What do you think they were saying? What are we supposed to do? Well, let's listen to the expert. Aaron knows him. Let's ask Aaron what we should do. And then what did they do? Pass or fail on that one? Well, we have a tendency to do that because we, as human beings, we're vulnerable, right? We know that. We know how vulnerable we are. We don't have claws like a tiger. We're not massive like elephants. Anything at any moment could crush us into the dust that we were made from, right? So people live in fear all the time. They're fear-driven. And righteousness has this way of driving out fear. Because if the one that I am attached to is righteous toward me, then what could destroy me? Like Paul said before, what could separate us from the love of God? If we're his children, what could we ever do that would make us not his children? Okay? It's chapter 8. But so moving on with this, he says, so in verse 14, I'll read through verse 14, and then I'll try to get some footing here. That's what I'm looking for, is footing, right? And I'm trying to find footing to give us a good segue into where Paul is going to begin this next argument. Because he ended last week he ended with there's no distinction. There's no Jew or Greek, for the same Lord is the Lord of all. He bestows his riches on all who call on him. For everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. Okay? That was verse 12. But that sets us up because a lot of people will take a lot of what Paul has to say and they'll take it out of context, right? And we'll forget what message Paul is trying to give. People take the potter message. How can the pot say to the potter, why have you made me this way? And people will take that and say, well, we should be accepting these people and loving them because that's the way that God made them. No, that's not the way God made us. Because God made us to be like his son, didn't he? In his image. The only one who ever truly reflected God into the world was who? Jesus, right? And when we think about the qualities of Jesus, come on. How many of us have ever truly reflected the qualities of Jesus into the world? The way that Jesus reflected God into the world. Paul himself even knows he falls short of that. He says it. He says, why do I do the things I don't want to do? Yet he struggles with himself. He wrestles with who he is and his identity. But he moves on from that argument, and then from here, he's starting to lay out what it means to be a child, okay? And what it means to live righteously, what that word actually means. Not what we've made it, what it actually means to be righteous. Because God is righteous, his Son is righteous, and the rest of us, well, we're working on it, right? We're a work in progress. We lean on his righteousness and not our own. I think I talked extensively about that last week and the week before and the week before that, because it's not our righteousness that makes us right. It's what he did for us that makes us right. That's what makes us as Christians unique, is that we can't attain righteousness. It has to be given. Okay, so I'm going to read on through verse 14. If you get anything out of this, get what Paul has to say in the argument. I'll try to break it down the best that I can to try to make it more digestible for everybody. But Paul's going to set the table for us, okay? So it's verse 14 then. How then will they call on him in whom they have not believed? And how are they to believe in him of whom they have never heard? And how are they to hear without someone preaching? And how are they to preach unless they are sent? As it is written, how beautiful are the feet of those who preach the good news. But they have not all obeyed the gospel. For Isaiah says, Lord, who has believed what he has heard from us? So faith comes from hearing, and hearing through the word of Christ. But I ask, have they not heard? Indeed, they have. Their voice has gone out to all the earth, and all their words to the end of the world. But I ask, did Israel not understand? First, Moses says, I will make you jealous of those who are not a nation. With a foolish nation, I will make you angry. Then Isaiah is so bold to say, I have found by those who did not seek me. I have been found by those who did not seek me. I have shown myself to those who did not ask for me. But of Israel, he says, all day long I have held out my hands to a disobedient and contrary people. Okay, so that ends chapter 10. So next week we'll go into 11, because there's actually a lot here. Because what Paul is quoting, do you guys know what Paul's quoting? He says what he's quoting. He says he's quoting Isaiah, right? So he says he's quoting Isaiah. But he says, but he starts it, right? We say this, we use this passage a lot of times, verse 14 through 17. We use this passage a lot of times to be justification for some kind of missionary mission. You guys heard that before? Where a missionary will come up and say, you know, you guys got to give me money. You guys got to send me so that I can be hurt, right? So that we can preach the gospel to all the nations. And I would really love to think that every missionary that's ever gone out and tried to raise money for a cause did it for the right reasons. But that's not always true, is it? We know that because they're what? In the end, they're just like, they're people, right? You hear of all the time, you hear of all kinds of people who are just trying to collect money and fill the collection plate so they can buy themselves a brand new jet or get themselves a new house or get themselves a this. They use this to try to justify that. And I'm going to try to break that idea, right? That's what I'm going to do. And I think my brother's got me on YouTube right now, so some TV evangelists might get mad at me. I'm not going to name any names, but you guys know all the ones that I'm going to blink about and talk about. Because they try to use, and I pray for those people, because what do you think that they're doing? If you guys, this is why this place right here is the scariest place to be. You know why? Because you guys are God's people. How happy do you think he is every time someone takes advantage of God's people? Yeah, that's scary. That carries a weight that everyone should always think about anytime they're put in the position of being in charge of God's people. My children, you know my children? I treat them like if I have to do some kind of punishment or something or do some daddy thing with them, right? You know where I go to first? The Bible. You know why? Because they're not my kids. Did you know that? Your children aren't your children. Who put them there in the first place? God stitched them together. And each one of us, guess what? Who stitched us together? That's a good thing to realize. It's also scary because you're responsible for those little people. So he says, how then will they call on him in whom they have not believed? So what he's saying is he's going to throw out a bunch of questions, because what he wants you to do, anytime someone asks you a question, what do they want you to do? They want you to think about it. That's right. See, in our modern Western society, we have this tendency to, every time someone asks a question, what are we supposed to do? We come up with an answer, right? It's like problem solution. Everything's problem solution, problem solution. You think Jesus asked questions in the Bible for you to come up with a solution? Because the solution was right there in front of you when you asked the question. He asked the question so that you would think about the appropriate answer. It reminds me of the teacher of the law who came up to Jesus one day, and I quote this one all the time because it's one of my favorites, okay? Because the Good Samaritan is another one of those that people take completely out of context. Teacher of the law comes up to Jesus and he says, Jesus, what's the greatest commandment? Jesus says, what do you think the greatest commandment is? He throws the question right back at him, doesn't he? And then the teacher of the law responds, oh, yeah, well, it's to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. And Jesus is like, good answer. And he goes to walk away. And then the teacher's like, well, wait a second. Well, who's my neighbor? And then what does Jesus do? Opens up a big, long parable. But do you know that when he did that parable, you guys all know the parable of the Good Samaritan? Okay, I hope so. It's been so taught and so misunderstood for so long. But when he's doing that, it's the context of the relationship that he has with that tax collector right there. Do you realize that? It's the beauty of that parable. Is that, who was that parable intended for? That tax collector, right? It was intended, well, no, I'm sorry, not the tax collector. The teacher of the law. It was the teacher of the law. It was intended for him right there. Right there, in that moment, that was the intention. Because that's all existed between Jesus, the physical embodiment of God, and somebody who thought that they were really close to God. But he asked the wrong question, didn't he? He asked the question of who is my neighbor, not what makes a good neighbor. So Jesus tells a big, long parable in order to ask the question of what makes a good neighbor in context of a relationship that he has with this teacher of the law. Do you think when that guy thought about that parable over and over again, do you think that it changed his mind or his heart or both? Because here's the answer to all his problems right here in front of him. Because his biggest question is, who is this guy Jesus, right? That's what he wanted to find out. That's what they all wanted to find out. So how do you test that? Oh, teacher, what's the greatest commandment, right? That's how you can tell if somebody's read their Bible. What's the greatest commandment? Well, the prophets, when you go through the books of the prophets, each one of them tries to sum up the law. And it gets smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. Did you know that? If you go through the books of the prophets and you read it, from the minor prophets to the greater prophets, every time they sum up the law, it gets smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. Jeremiah says, well, Jeremiah, the mouthpiece from God, says that I desire mercy and not sacrifice. That's the greatest law. He could have quoted that one. It's the greatest commandment. Do you think Jesus would have told the same parable? Probably. As the teacher of the law, the words of the Bible are flowing through his head. What do you think he's thinking about? He's thinking about all the places where the prophets have summed up the law and trying to come up with the best answer he can. And when he's bombarded by all those answers that he already knows, and Jesus tells the parable, what do you think he's looking for? Mercy. Because what does he answer with? The one who showed what? Who is the good neighbor? And how does the tax collector answer? The one who showed mercy. Right? Because why do I keep calling him a tax collector? I keep messing up. The teacher of the law. He's definitely on the opposite spectrum of a tax collector, okay? Two totally different people. Two totally different personas and everything else. So it's the context of the conversation that he's having So then, well, let's think, to put this in perspective, as he's bombarding us with these questions, let's think about the people who he's asking these questions to. Do you remember the church in Rome was a mix of people? You had all these brand new people. I call them barbarians. It's probably not fair to call them barbarians, right? And then you had these Gentile believers, and then you had these Jews who just come back in, and everyone's on equal footing because there's no power structure to the church. The Jews had just been exiled because of the wars in Jerusalem. They exiled all the Jews back, just like we did to the Asians in World War II. They exiled them back to Jerusalem, and they said, this is where you're going to stay, and then the war's over, so all those people can come back home, where their home was, in Rome. And they come back to the church when they were the ones who originally founded the church, and now there's all these Gentiles and all these new believers, and the church has grown exponentially under persecution, believe it or not. So when he's asking these questions, I think he's posing these questions to the entire audience because he says, how then will they call on him in whom they have not believed, right? So here's the Jews and the Gentiles who are like, oh yeah, well, we heard this guy, right? You're thinking about it. Well, there was this guy who was talking about Jesus, and that's what ended me up here. And there's these Jews who are like, yeah, we were listening to the chatter in the synagogue and the rumors in the back, and that's what brought us here. And the barbarians, right, which I'm not being fair to the people who are on the outside of the church who have just been brought in, the people who probably still go to the temple of Zeus, probably still do their stuff at the temple of Zeus, who've just been brought in, and they're like, oh yeah, that's exactly why I'm here, because I want to find out about who this guy is, right? So you have three different groups with three different perspectives. And as Paul is writing this, he knows that there's separation. There's separation in every church. Surprise, right? There's separation. People develop into cliques, and they say, well, those people, they comb their hair over to the right. Those people comb their hair over to the left. So we're going to sit over here with them, and then we're going to sit over here with them, those people, and then we'll be one happy. We're a family as long as we look the same or act the same or say the same words, right? It happens all the time. Right? You guys, I don't have to give you a lecture on how division works among humankind because we do it in every way we could possibly imagine. If Jesus healed someone's eyes with mud and didn't heal someone's eyes and healed someone's eyes without mud, you'd have people who are Muddites and people who are anti-Muddites, right? I mean, look at how many denominations of Christianity we have today. Can you count them? Right? It's like trying to count the stars. Abram, count the stars. How many are there? So but remember, before this verse, he said there's no distinction between Jew and Greek, right? So the Jews who have been given the word, and the Greeks who are sitting over here, not the barbarians, those people, he's not talking about those people. He's saying that these two people are on equal footing, but these people out here, they have no idea. It's an underhanded comment that Paul made, but how are those people going to understand if none of you ever talk to them? Okay, we use this as a passage to say we need to go overseas and missionary to someone that's in some third world country, right? That the gospel needs to be carried overseas. And I'll tell you right now, a real missionary is not someone, and I've said this before, a real missionary is not someone who crosses the seas. It's someone who sees the cross, right? It's someone who sees the cross and what he's done for the neighbor that you have. Real righteousness is that I know what God did for me. Maybe he can do it for you. Maybe. I don't know, right? Make it a selling point. I don't want to turn it into a selling point because the only thing to offer is salvation, right? And most people today, if you were to ask them, have you heard? Have you heard the good news? Right? You can start that conversation. Have you heard the good news? That Jesus came to die for your sins so you could attain salvation and be righteous with God. And then they go back with, what do I need to be saved from? I got everything I wanted. I'm driving the brand new Tesla. I've got the stimulus check and all, I've got every material need that I want. It's a gilded cage. It's a gilded cage. And it will lead you to the place where you do not want to be. So he moves on and he says, and how are they to believe in him whom they have never heard? And how are they to hear without someone preaching? And how are they to preach unless they are sent? Okay, remember, there's a division in the church. And you have these Jews over here, right, who are probably thinking, yeah, we need to go do something, right? We need to go do something because these people, they need to be like us, right? Do you guys remember Paul in Corinthians, Ephesians? How much time Paul spends in the New Testament trying to talk about how you don't need to make Gentiles into Jews. You need to all be Christians, one identity, one family, one brotherhood, sisterhood, one family. You need to be one family. How much time does Paul spend doing that? A lot of time. You know why? Because every time someone hears these words, well, how are they going to believe if you don't go tell them? Every time someone hears those words, they have this tendency to think that they're the ones who have all the answers, right? That I have to go fix that person over there. How many of us, if we're honest with ourselves, are capable of fixing another human being? None of us. We can't. We spend so much time trying to do it, don't we? We're like, hey, you need to change your ways, you're going down. Hey, you need to do this or you're going down. The whole time, they don't believe a single word you're saying because who are you to them? Right? Like I said, someone who sees the cross, that's a missionary. Because the grace that God has given all of us, we take it for granted? Yes. How could we not? How could we not? I mean, really, when you think about it, how could we not take it for granted? Because if we really understood what it meant, what would we be doing? No. Our feet would be worn out, wouldn't they? It would be worn out telling people the good news. So Paul talks about preaching. And how are they to hear without someone preaching? Now, here's the thing that's interesting. Everyone seems to think that preaching is where you get super emotional and you tell people about how terrible of a person they are and how awful they are. It's not preaching. Preaching, real preaching, is just telling people who Jesus is. Because if you go back to Mark, right? When you go back to the book of Mark, just open it, Jesus began to preach the good news. And then look, right there. Mark chapter 1. Going to find out what preaching is? There it is. It's right there. For some reason, we skip over it all the time. Started to preach the good news. John the Baptist, he was preaching. He said, anyone tree that does not bear good fruit will be cut down. God's coming back. God's coming back. Daddy's coming home. And if you don't have your room cleaned, there's going to be trouble. That's the summation of the message. Now, John's more colorful with his verbs than I am, right? John's more fiery, but I don't think he yelled it to people. I think he just quoted. Because where does he move from here? Where does he move from here? How beautiful are the feet that carry the good news? Right? Trivia, right? This is a real question. You can answer it if you want. Do you know where that comes from? How beautiful are the feet that carry the good news? It's got to be from one of the prophets, doesn't it? You can narrow it down for you. Let me just take a stab at it. Isaiah? Because where is he going to quote from next? Paul's going to begin a line of argumentation from Isaiah, almost exclusively from Isaiah. Okay, so that tells me one thing. One thing. The audience that he's directly speaking to right now would be the Jews. It would be his Jewish brothers. Because how does he start? How does he start this whole chapter? What's his heart's desire? That his brothers by birth would be saved. So here's the thing that's really interesting. Paul knows that the congregation that he's writing this letter to is filled with barbarians, and it's filled with Gentiles who are think of it like people who go to mega churches. They do all their stuff during the week and then they repent on Sunday, right? That's mainly your mega church attendance. And then the only reason they go to church most of the time is so that they can feel good about themselves. So like, I did something, I feel like I'm closer to God, good, now I'm going to go do whatever I want for the rest of the 6 days of the week, right? We know that happens. I'm not convicting everyone who goes to a mega church. I'm just speaking in general terms. Because there's people who actually do that, who don't live by the words. They think that if, God's grace is unlimited. Yeah, well, they didn't read Romans, did they? But he begins this chapter with how earnest he is, about how heartfelt he is, about how his brothers and sisters would get it. Those who were born into the family. They were born into it. They were given the word. They stumbled and they fell and they didn't believe and they did all kinds of terrible things. They were the very ones who crucified Jesus. His blood is on their hands. Remember? He said it. Let it be on our children's hands. Well, now Paul is communicating directly to the children of those who Jesus' blood was directly on their hands. Now what Paul is distinctly saying here, as he's quoting these passages from Isaiah, these passages from Isaiah are a build-up to God is coming back. That's preaching, okay? But he's preaching in a way that they have to think about it. Is that not good or what? Come on. Paul's a genius. Paul's a genius because he's making you remember all the things that you should have in the book of Isaiah. And if you don't, you better get to work. That's what he's saying. He says, how beautiful are the feet of those who preach the good news. And this is one thing that's interesting in my translation, and I don't know if you guys have it. Does it say gospel there? Good news? It says gospel, right? Mine has it translated into the English what gospel is, good news, right? But they have not all obeyed the gospel. I don't know why my translation does that. In one text, in one area, it's the same word in Greek. That's my translation. I'm just kind of getting Bible nerdy on you guys here, so just bear with me. If it's boring you, go ahead and take a nap. But in my translation, it says, how beautiful are the feet of those who preach the good news. Now, what does gospel mean? Good news, okay? But for some reason, I'm glad you guys all got that. Everybody got that. That's fantastic. So for mine, for some reason, it says, but they have not all obeyed the gospel, right? They have not all obeyed it. So what's the good news? What's the good news? So Mark chapter 1, God's coming back. Guess what? He's going to cut down every tree that doesn't bear good fruit. He's going to cast it into the fire. Guess what? Party's over. Party's over, guys. Everything you've done wrong, you're going to be accountable for. That's what preaching is. That's what preaching is. And you tell them that's preaching, right? You tell them how terrible they are as human beings and how they've made a wreck of their life. And this is the reason they've wrecked their life. And then, guess what? You have the good news. The good news is that Jesus came to die for us, to show us what God's love really was, so that we could be led into his kingdom through his love. Not ours, but his. Because we know what we are. I mean, Paul spent 8 chapters talking about how terrible human beings we are. We shouldn't be feeling good about how awesome we are at following rules, because Paul's already debunked that one, hasn't he? It's like the only reason you followed the rules in the first place, I'm just paraphrasing Paul. The only reason you followed the rules in the first place is because you thought there was some kind of reward. That doesn't make you a child of God, because you thought there was a reward at the end. That's the only reason you followed. If you really loved, then the reason you'd follow is because you realized that you didn't want to see the look of disappointment in your dad's face. Right? Why do you think Jesus did the things that he did? He loved his Father. And even more so, he loved us. So moving on from that, because he starts to bombard us with Isaiah, doesn't he? Lord, who has believed what he has heard from us. Okay, so that's another quote from Isaiah, right? Because God sends Isaiah out. It's kind of a funny story. God sends Isaiah out to a people who don't have ears to hear, and people who are blind as bats. Yeah, stiff-necked, yeah. And he's like, I'm sending you out to these people. It's like 7 chapters into the book of Isaiah, and all of a sudden it just starts out. He's talking to the king and doing this stuff, and then all of a sudden one day God shows up, and there's an angel with a burning coal, and the whole story of the Bible changes from there. Did you know that? That's the turning point in the Bible. Because everything up to that point, if you did something wrong, you had to do something to right it. You realize that? But the moment Isaiah comes before the throne of God, I'm going to start talking about Isaiah, rabbit trail, right? But it is in the context of what Paul's saying. The moment Isaiah is confronted by the holy presence of God, what's his response? How awesome and how righteous he is? No, he falls to his face, doesn't he? And he says, here's a prophet of God, right? Just like Jonah, just like Jeremiah. Just pick one, Amos. Here's a prophet of God. And the moment he's confronted by God's presence, what does he do? He falls on his face and he says, behold, I'm a man of unclean lips, from a people of uncleanliness. 7 chapters in. This story doesn't start the moment God steps into his life. The story started, and then God stepped into it. And then what's God's response? God is the one who cleans him. He touches his lips with a burning coal. That's the part where the whole Bible narrative changes. Because up until that point, what did you have to do? Well, if you accidentally touched a dead body, you had to separate yourself for 3 days, cut your hair, wash your clothes, and then you were ritually pure again. It wasn't sinful to be impure, but uncleanliness was a big deal back then. It was a big deal to become in contact with dead bodies or anything like that. There were several things that you could be considered unclean for. I'm not going to walk through all 189, but at that moment in the Bible narrative is when the whole story changes. And now it's not man who cleans himself before he can go to God. It's God who cleans man so he can come before him. Welcome. Welcome to the story. Right? If that doesn't have good news wrote all over it, I don't know what does. Because I don't know what could wash away all the terrible things that I've done in my life. How would I do that? Well, here's the preaching part. Here's God, and he's great. He's awesome. He's never messed up, never made a single mistake in his entire life. And here you are, standing before him. What are you going to do? Well, I have good news. Because of God's love, what did he do? He sent his only son, so that we, not deserving the grace that he's given us, could find it and know what real love is. Right? Amen? So he's going through Isaiah, because here's these people who don't know their left hand from their right hand, to quote the book of Jonah, right? And here's all these people who do, or at least they should. And that's what happens. That's the biggest division, I think, in church. It's heartbreaking. It breaks God's heart. Because here you have, who adopted those people into the church? God did. Why would anyone ever want to come here and a lecture by a Jewish rabbi from the first century? It just doesn't make any sense. I mean, you don't watch it on TV, do you? It's not something you see big commercials presented to you by Verizon Wireless, right? First century Jewish guy talking about the kingdom of heaven. Why would anybody be drawn to that? Who would draw you? It's a good question. Because the Holy Spirit draws. And then we embrace. Because all the people that he brings in here, he brings in here. Just like the kids in your household. Did he bring them into your household? It's a good question. Because if you really think about it, who are these people who don't fill these seats or do fill these seats? Right? Like last week I talked about growing roots. And I think it's of greater value a lot of times that you have people who understand more of what love is than you have people who just show up. You know what I mean? Like, you guys are my family. I love you guys. I hope you love me. But it doesn't matter if you love me or not, because I have to. You don't have to reciprocate, because I have to, because he loved me first. Amen. That's right. I've missed you. So he says, so he moves into Isaiah, because Isaiah is one of these, Isaiah is so good. Have you guys ever sit and done an intensive study of Isaiah through the context of God's relationship to his people? You just think about it. Read through Isaiah and just think about how much God cares about his people and how they're blind and stiff-necked. And how is he going to get them back? The only way to get them back is to give them over. When they realize how bad things are, guess what? They'll come back. But he cares about each and every one of them. He does. Because he says, so faith comes from hearing, and hearing through the word of Christ. So whose words is it? That trust. I know, faith, we get that a lot of times. Faith and trust, remember, they're interchangeable words. So I'm going to say it the other way and see if it resonates. So trust comes from hearing, and hearing through the word of Christ. So whose words are that? Is it Mr. Olstein's words? Is it Adam's words? Is it anyone's words? It's Christ's words. His word is what brings people in. You know, for the first 30 years of my life, I heard all this stuff and I was like, yeah, whatever, right? I've got stuff to do. This is just personal testimony, and I wish my brother would turn off the camera right now, but he's not going to. So personal testimony, I'm vulnerable.